I see a quorum. I must inform members that the clerk of the committee can only receive motions for the election of the chair. The clerk cannot receive other types of motions, cannot entertain points of order, nor participate in debate. We can now proceed to the election of the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1062, the chair must be a member of the government party. I am ready to receive motions for the chair.
Mr. Clerk?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yes?
I would like to nominate Peter Shafke for the chair.
Il est proposé par
It has been moved by Ms. Koutrakis that Peter Shifke be elected as chair of the committee. Are there any other motions?
Yes, Mr. Iacono?
I'm wondering, did you see my hand up? It was up before Mrs. Koutrakis' hand went up.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't. I was looking around the room and this hybrid.
Okay.
Yeah, it's whoever jumped on the mic first got my attention.
Well,
sorry.
I raised my hand to be polite, and I was waiting for you to let me speak because I was gonna.
Sorry
I was
about
gonna
that.
do exactly what Mrs. Koutrakis did. Thank you very much.
Okay, I do apologize.
Mr. Clerk, my apologies to my esteemed colleague. I did not realize that. I didn't see him in the room, and there was a pause, and I thought that I would help. But I don't have a problem with Mr. Iacono being the one nominating Mr. Shafke.
Well, the issue is I cannot receive any other type of motion nor entertain points of order. So here we are. We have a motion on the floor from Ms. Koutrakis that Mr. Peter Shifke be elected as chair of the committee. Are there any other motions? Seeing none, pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, November 25th, 2021, I will now proceed to a recorded division unless there is consent to adopt the motion. Seeing consent, I declare the motion carried and Mr. Shifke duly elected chair of the committee.
Hear, hear.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, chers collègues.
Thank you very much, and thank you, dear colleagues, for your confidence. I'm very pleased to be elected chair of this committee. Before starting, I wanted to take a few moments to thank our colleague Vance Badaway for the exceptional work he did in his role as chair of this committee during the 43rd Parliament. So thank you again for your excellent work. And you too, the 5 members of this committee who are back. You did excellent work in the 42nd and 43rd Parliaments, and I'd like to sincerely thank you. Congratulations.
Before we move on to some housekeeping notes that I have to read, I'd like to, if you're in agreement, ask the clerk to proceed with the election of the vice chairs. All in agreement? Okay. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you. Conformément à l'article 106.2, le premier vice-président.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1062, the first vice chair must be a member of the official opposition. I'm now ready to prepare to receive motions for the first vice chair.
I'd like to nominate Melissa Landsman as the vice chair.
It has been moved by MP Marilyn Gladu that Melissa Landsman be elected as first vice chair of the committee. Are there any further motions? Seeing none, pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, November 25th, I will now proceed to recorded division unless there is consent to adopt the motion. Seeing consent, I declare the motion carried and Melissa Lantzman duly elected as first vice chair of the committee. Eh bien, conformément à l'article 106.2, le second
Pursuant to Standing Order 106.2, the second vice chair must be a member of an opposition party other than the official opposition. I am now prepared to receive motions for the second vice chair.
Mr. Backrack?
Mr. Clerk, I'd like to nominate Mr. Barcelou Duval to be the second vice chair of the committee.
Il est proposé par Mr.
It has been moved by Mr. Backrack that Mr. Barcelou Duval be elected as second vice chair of the committee. Are there any other motions? Pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, November 25th, 2021, I will now proceed to a recorded division unless there is unanimous consent. I declare the motion adopted and Mr. Barcelou Duval is elected second vice chair of the committee.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Greffier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. Welcome to meeting number 1 of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Regarding the speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether participating virtually or in person. I would like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website.
Pandemic colleague, and in light of the recommendations from public health authorities, as well as the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on October 19th, 2021, to remain healthy and safe, the following is recommended for all those attending the meeting in person. Anyone with symptoms should participate by Zoom and not attend the meeting in person. Everyone must maintain 2-meter physical distancing, whether seated or standing. Everyone must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room. It is recommended in the strongest possible terms that members wear their masks at all times, including when seated. Non-medical masks, which provide better clarity over cloth masks, are available in the room. And everyone present must maintain proper hand hygiene by using the hand sanitizer at the room entrance. Committee rooms are cleaned before and after each meeting. To maintain this, everyone is encouraged to clean surfaces such as the desk, chair, and microphone with the provided disinfectant wipes when vacating or taking a seat. As the chair, I will be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting, and I thank members in advance for their cooperation. I would like to now suggest, colleagues, that as the next order of business, that the committee now proceed to considering our routine motions. Okay. Ms. Koutrakis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations on your election. And I truly look forward to working with you and all our colleagues on this very important committee. In the interest of time, I was wondering if we could go ahead and adopt the routine motions as circulated by the clerk to all the members before this meeting rather than go one by one.
Colleagues, do we have unanimous consent to adopt them in one bulk?
I'm happy to come. Mr. Chair, can we go one by one, please?
Okay, we do not have unanimous consent to do so. We can definitely go one by one. Ms. Koutrakis, would you be kind enough to go through them one by one, please?
Perfect. Just give me 1 second. Que le comité retienne.
That the committee retain as needed and at the discretion of the chair the services of one.
Clarification before I continue. Is there appetite amongst the committee members for me to go through all the clauses and we take the vote at the end, or do we want to do a vote after each item that I read out?
At the end?
Yep, just one.
Okay, so Ms. Koutrakis, if you could just proceed and read them all out, we'll vote at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Que le comité
That the committee retain as needed and at the discretion of the chair the services of one or more analysts from the Library of Parliament to assist it in its work.
agenda and procedure be established and be composed of 5 members, the chair, 1 member from each recognized party, and that the subcommittee work in a spirit of collaboration.
That the chair be authorized to hold meetings, to receive evidence, and to have that evidence published when a quorum is not present, provided that at least 4 members are present, including 2 members of the opposition parties and 2 members of the government party. But when traveling outside the parliamentary precinct, that the meeting begin after 15 minutes, regardless of members present.
Be given 5 minutes for their opening statement, that whenever possible, witnesses provide the committee with their opening statement 72 hours in advance, that at the discretion of the chair, during the questioning of witnesses, there be allocated 6 minutes for the first questioner of each party, as follows for the first round: Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Bloc Québécois, New Democratic Party. For the second and subsequent rounds, the order and time for questioning be as follows: Conservative Party, 5 minutes, Liberal Party, 5 minutes, Bloc Québécois, 2.5 minutes, New Democratic Party, 2.5 minutes, Conservative Party, 5 minutes, Liberal Party, 5 minutes.
That only the clerk of the committee be authorized to distribute documents to members of the committee, provided the documents are in both official languages, and that the witnesses be advised accordingly.
That the clerk of the committee, at the discretion of the chair, be authorized to make the necessary arrangements to provide working meals for the committee and its subcommittees.
That, if requested, reasonable travel, accommodation, and living expenses be reimbursed to witnesses not exceeding 2 representatives per organization, and that, in exceptional circumstances, payment for more representatives be made at the discretion of the chair.
That unless otherwise ordered, each committee member be allowed to be accompanied by 1 staff member at in-camera meetings, and that 1 additional person from each House officer's office be allowed to be present.
That 1 copy of the transcript of each in-camera meeting be kept in the committee clerk's office for consultation by members of the committee or by their staff, and that the analysts assigned to the committee also have access to the in-camera transcripts.
That a 48-hour notice interpreted as 2 nights be required for any substantive motion to be moved in committee, unless the substantive motion relates directly to business then under consideration, provided that A, the notice be filed with the clerk of the committee no later than 4 p.m. from Monday to Friday, B, the motion be distributed to members and the offices of the whips of each recognized party in both official languages by the clerk on the same day the said notice was transmitted, if it was received no later than the deadline hour. C, notices received after the deadline hour or on non-business days be deemed to have been received during the next business day, and that when the committee is holding meetings outside the parliamentary precinct, no substantive motion may be moved. Good.
That in relation to orders of reference from the House respecting bills, A, the clerk of the committee shall, upon the committee receiving such an order of reference, write to each member who is not a member of a caucus represented on the committee to invite those members to file with the clerk of the committee in both official languages any amendments to the bill, which is the subject of the said order, which they would suggest that the committee consider. B. Suggested amendments filed pursuant to paragraph A at least 48 hours prior to the start of clause-by-clause consideration of the bill to which the amendments relate shall be deemed to be proposed during the said consideration, provided that the committee may, by motion, vary this deadline in respect of a given bill. And C. During the clause-by-clause consideration of a bill, the chair shall allow a member who filed suggested amendments pursuant to paragraph A an opportunity to make brief representations in support of them.
That the clerk inform each witness who is to appear before the committee that the House Administration Support Team must conduct technical tests to check the connectivity and the equipment used to ensure the best possible sound quality, and that the chair advise the committee at the start of each meeting of any witness who did not perform the required technical tests.
That all documents submitted for committee business that do not come from a federal department, members' offices, or that have not been translated by the Translation Bureau be sent for prior linguistic review by the Translation Bureau before being distributed to members.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Katrakis. Is there any debate, questions, or comments? Oui, Monsieur Barson.
Oui.
Yes, I want to have a clarification for the number of members of the committee. I do not have a number in the document I have. I wasn't paying attention, so if you could clarify that for me, that's a good question. The clerk is telling me that it's 5, Mr. Barsalou-Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. You're not coming through loudly enough for some reason, but that's okay. I did hear my name. I just wondering, so the list of routine motions that Ms. Katrakis has read out, those are the ones I think that there's general agreement on. I have some additions that I'd like to bring forward for discussion. I'm wondering if we should vote on the first set and then have that discussion separately, or whether you'd like me to bring those forward at this point.
Is there unanimous consent to adopt these motions as is and then move on to others? Yes. Okay, adopted. Thank you, colleagues. Mr. Bachrach, did you want to proceed with your motions, as I see no other hands up?
I would. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. So the first routine motion that I would like to propose. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I can't see the room on my screen very well here because the camera is not. My apologies, Mr. Chair. The first routine motion I'd like to bring forward for consideration is one that I believe we passed last Parliament, and it relates to televised appearances of ministers. And the wording of the motion is very simple. It is that whenever a minister appears before the committee, every effort be made to ensure that the meeting is televised.
Okay. Questions or comments? All those in favor? All those opposed? Adopted.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, I have one more here. This relates to in-camera meetings. And again, it is similar to a motion that was adopted in the last Parliament. And it reads that the committee may meet in camera only for the following purposes. A, to consider a draft report. B, to attend briefings concerning national security. C, to consider lists of witnesses. and D, for any other reason with the unanimous consent of the committee, that all votes taken in camera, with the exception of votes regarding the consideration of draft reports, be recorded in the minutes of proceedings, including how each member voted when recorded votes are requested.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Questions or comments? Questions ou commentaires?
Questions or comments?
OK, pas de questions ou commentaires.
No questions or comments? Oh, Ms. Koutrakis. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps we could move on to the vote on this?
Somebody called a question, though. OK, on va continuer avec le débat. Mr.
Okay, we'll continue with the debate. Mr. Badaway.
Like last time when this was presented, I can't support this. There's a reason why we go into camera for certain items, and that's to protect employees, human resources, to protect legal situations and legal discussions, proprietary situations that a lot of the different companies that we have as that give testimony that we discuss, and with respect to that, as well as other, it could be a negotiation between a union and a company that may come up, and we may have to discuss it as a committee. In-camera meetings, and albeit, by the way, I'm not a fan of in-camera meetings. I'd like to see everything out in the open, but I think it's not up to me in situations like that. It's with all due respect to those that come give testimony and actually trust the process, won't disclose a lot of what they don't want to disclose in terms of, again, as I mentioned earlier, those things that should be held in confidence. So I think with that said, in-camera meetings are appropriate. They should only be taking place when those are being infringed upon, such as HR, negotiations, or legal. I think Mr. Bachrach will be fully aware of that as a former mayor in terms of what municipal acts in different provinces entail. And again, it's with all due respect to those people that we deal with. So, and unfortunately, Taylor, I won't be able to support this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to Mr. Badaway, I appreciate what he's saying. I think, perhaps item D, I believe, accommodates the type of situation that he has brought up. So if we're in a situation as a committee where there is some sort of sensitive topic that deserves a confidential treatment, the committee can choose to go in camera by unanimous consent. And I think that, the members of the committee can use their discretion in terms of the public interest, maximizing transparency. What we don't want to see is we don't want to see in-camera meetings used to discuss matters that may be difficult for some members to talk about in the public realm, but are in the public interest to have the public see our discussions and hear our questioning, etc. So I think that these clauses accommodate the kind of situation that Mr. Badaway has indicated, and certainly coming from local government in British Columbia, there are very strict provisions for the circumstances in which local governments can go in camera. And I think we should have similar parameters for our committee so that those in-camera meetings aren't misused.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I appreciate those comments. However, 2 points I want to make. One is that the key words is unanimous or consent, and not all the time do we have the luxury of gaining unanimous consent. The second point I want to make, and it goes to your point about item D, if in fact item D covers everything, then there's really no need to pass this motion. it's somewhat redundant. So again, unfortunately, Taylor, I just can't support this.
Mr. Iacono.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to add to my colleague, by the way, we can go about it by deciding on a case by case. That would be more appropriate. And I too do not accept this motion.
Any further comments, questions? Yes, Mr. Backrack.
Just very briefly, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that we're of two minds about this and certainly respect the views that my colleagues have brought forward. Just for clarification, perhaps the clerk or you, Mr. Chair, could clarify how the decision to go in camera on a topic would be made. Mr. Iacono has suggested that it be done on a case-by-case basis, and I have no problem with that. It's more a question of at whose discretion does the committee go in camera?
Backrack, Mr. Badaway.
I think going back to Mr. Backrack's motion.
Mr. Badaway, your microphone needs to be lowered, sir.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair?
And correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Clerk, but going to Mr. Backrack's motion, the appropriate part of the motion is unanimous consent in terms of a motion that would come forward. So I believe that if a case-by-case basis method was or mechanism was to be followed, would it not just take unanimous consent by the committee to then therefore go to the, I guess, to the theme of what Mr. Backrack's actually asking for in his motion?
We're actually going to turn to Mr. Backrack to explain this one if he can.
Okay, so explaining the gist of the motion, essentially the committee would be permitted to go in camera, to consider a draft report, to attend briefings concerning national security, to consider lists of witnesses, and for any other reason with the unanimous consent of the members of the committee. So it does essentially allow us to go in camera for any reason, as long as we all agree that the reason warrants going in camera. And what it prevents is the use of in camera to discuss things that, may be publicly sensitive, but are not issues that, for legal reasons or other reasons, should be held in camera. Does that make sense, Mr. Chair?
I'm just looking to see whether or not there are any hands raised by colleagues who have any further questions or comments on this particular motion. And if I do not see any...
Monsieur le Président.
Oh, Mr.
Chair. Yes, Mr. Bassan-Duval. Well, just to get some clarification on how this works, because I feel like Mr. Backrack asked the question earlier to the clerk, at least, but that we did not hear the answer. I would like to know concretely, if we don't adopt this motion, how the decision would be made to move in camera. Would it be the chair? Would it be how would it work?
So this is
Donc,
indicated, in essence, the clerk would be in a situation where he would have to speak to this, and it perhaps would be seen as him either defending it or moving in favor of it. And we're actually deferring more to Mr. Backrack to try and speak to, if we were to find ourselves in that situation, how exactly would the committee then proceed in voting? And this is a question that's been posed by our colleague, Monsieur Barcelo Duval.
So the question is, how would we procedurally go about going in camera if this motion passed? Is that correct, Mr. Chair, if I understand the question, or was that a question from the clerk?
That was actually a question from Mr. Barcelo Duval par rapport à si on...
That was a question from Mr. Barcelo Duval. In fact, if we find ourselves in that situation, Mr. Chair, perhaps Mr. Barcelo Duval, you could clarify. Yes, in fact, my question was to the clerk, that is, if we don't vote for this motion, not if we vote for it, if we don't vote for this motion, if we don't adopt this motion, how would moving in camera work? Who would be making that decision? Is the committee consulted when we move in camera, or try to, or not?
Oh, sorry for the confusion. I believe the question was about what happens with questions that are taken while you're in camera under the provisions of this motion, which is very tricky because we'd be recording names and whatnot, which is sort of counter to how we do in camera. But if you're talking about in a regular meeting without this motion, if one were to go in camera, we simply require a motion. It's a dilatory motion, so you can move it off the floor at any time, and you just take a vote. It's no debate, just a vote right away on whether or not to go in camera. Conversely, the chair can also call for a meeting to begin in camera. And if the committee does not agree to that, the very first thing that the committee would do at the beginning of that in-camera meeting is someone would move to go public. No debate, you just take a vote and go public if that's the will of the committee.
Monsieur Barcelo Duval, est-ce que ça a bien répondu à votre question?
Did that answer your question, Mr. Barcelo Duval? Yes, thank you.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres commentaires ou questions?
Thank you to you.
Motion. Okay. We'll proceed to the vote. All those in favor?
Actually, probably, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to do recorded division. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Backrack?
In favor.
Mr. Badaway?
No.
Monsieur Barcelo Duval?
Pour.
Mr. Chahal?
No.
Mr. Dowdle? Ms. Gladu?
No.
Monsieur Iacono?
No.
Ms. Koutrakis?
Contre.
Ms. Lantzman?
Contre.
Mr. Muiz?
No.
Mr. Rogers?
No.
2, 4, 7 against. Sorry, 2, 4, 7 against.
The motion is not carried. Are there any other motions that colleagues would like to present? Mr. Backrack.
I was, Mr. Chair, I was going to bring forward a third one, but regarding witness allocation, and this is a motion that other committees have passed, but I thought I would just maybe speak to the spirit and see if we can get general agreement from yourself and from the committee. I believe it was our practice in the last Parliament that when we had a 2-hour witness panel, that each party would have a witness from their submitted lists appear, so that we had a diversity of witnesses on each panel. Other committees have chosen to codify that with a routine motion. I'm not sure that that's necessary, but perhaps Mr. Chair, you and Mr. Clerk could indicate whether that would be your intent, and if we could have that as a practice, I think that would suffice, and I would not bring forward a formal motion.
I'd like to get the thoughts of our members on this. Are there any questions or comments on this? Ms. Gladue?
Yes, as a former chair, I would say that while it is great to have diversity of thought, and when witnesses are submitted and, there's a quotient of them depending on the representation, you can't always schedule the witnesses when you want to schedule the witnesses because they're not available. So I would say that, if we took the intent that we would have diversity of thought and a mix of the witnesses, that would be a great way to proceed. But I wouldn't, fall on that sword if there's scheduling issues.
Thank you, Ms. Gladue. Any other questions or comments on this? So, Mr. Bachrach, I think I would just add my comments on this. As chair, I will do my very best to ensure that all members have their voices heard, and that's with regards to the witnesses that we invite to appear before this committee. But putting ourselves in a situation where, as Ms. Gladue had pointed out, in some cases it's very difficult to get the witnesses that we wanted to get, and we kind of pigeonhole ourselves into that situation. But as chair, I'm going to make every effort with the clerk to ensure that there is representation from all parties when we have witnesses appear.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That works for me. And with that, I'll end my comments on routine motions. Thanks for entertaining them.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Are there any other motions that colleagues would like to put forward? Seeing none? I wish I had a gavel. But can I get a motion to adjourn from one of my fine esteemed colleagues?
Move to adjourn.
Mr. Badaway moves to adjourn. All in favor? All opposed? Thank you, colleagues. I will simply add Merry Christmas to those of you who will be celebrating. I wish you a safe, happy,
Merry Christmas, all.
And prosperous New Year. All the best, everyone.
Joyeux Noël et bonne année.
Merci tout le monde.
Bon anno.
Take care, everybody. Happy holidays.
Bye. Happy holidays. Joyeux Noël.